Linux gaming just crossed a point of no return, and what's wild is that it didn't happen with a single announcement, a flashy keynote, or some dramatic Linux wins moment. It happened quietly, gradually, almost accidentally, and by the time most people noticed, it was already too late to undo. For decades, Linux gaming was framed as a compromise. You used Linux because you loved open source, because you hated Windows telemetry, because you wanted control, or because you were a developer or a tinkerer, but gaming was always the tax you paid for that freedom. You dual-booted Windows. You kept an old Windows partition just for games. You accepted that some titles would never work. Some anti-cheat would always block you, and some launches would just be broken. And yet, today, we're in a situation where switching back to Windows for gaming increasingly feels like the compromise instead. That's the irreversible shift, and it's why Linux gaming has crossed a point of no return. To understand why this matters, you have to remember where Linux gaming came from. For most of its history, Linux gaming meant native ports that arrived late, ran worse, and were abandoned quickly. A handful of studios like ID Software cared, Valve dabbled, and indie developers sometimes showed up, but Linux was never a first-class citizen. You'd fire up Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch Linux, Linux Mint, or OpenSUSE, install Steam, scroll through your library, and see most of your games grayed out with a small Windows-only note. When something did run natively, it was often stuck on an older version of OpenGL, missing features, or broken after the next kernel update. Gaming on Linux felt like swimming upstream. Then Proton happened, and at first, almost nobody took it seriously. Proton was framed as a compatibility layer, a neat trick, a way to run some Windows games on Linux without too much hassle. Expectations were low. People assumed it would always be inferior, always lag behind Windows, always break when a game updated. But what actually happened was the opposite. Proton didn't just catch up, it started to close gaps that native ports never could. Suddenly, instead of waiting for developers to care about Linux, Linux users could just play the Windows version. Steam on Ubuntu, Steam on Fedora, Steam on Arch Linux, Steam on Linux Mint, Steam on Pop! _OS, all pulling from the same Windows-focused ecosystem, but translating it into something Linux could run shockingly well. And here's where the point of no return really starts to show. Proton didn't plateau. It accelerated. Valve kept hiring, kept funding development, kept pushing fixes upstream into Wine, DXVKD3D, Mesa, and the Linux kernel itself. Every improvement made gaming on Linux better across the board, regardless of distro. Whether you were on Arch Linux with bleeding-edge Mesa, Fedora with its rapid kernel updates, Ubuntu LTS with stability-focused packages, or Pop! _OS with NVIDIA drivers pre-configured, the experience kept improving. Not in theory, not on paper, but in real-world click-play-it-works terms. Then the Steam Deck happened, and that was the moment the direction became irreversible. The Steam Deck isn't just a handheld gaming PC, it's a massive, ongoing compatibility test lab running Arch Linux-based Steam OS. Every verified game, every Proton update, every anti-cheat workaround, every performance optimization is driven by the need to make Linux gaming good enough for millions of consumers who don't even know they're using Linux. That's the key difference. Linux gaming is no longer powered primarily by enthusiasts willing to troubleshoot. It's powered by normal users who expect things to work. Once you reach that stage, there is no going back. When a developer makes a game compatible with the Steam Deck, they are, by extension, making it compatible with Linux desktops running Arch Linux, Fedora, Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Pop! _OS, EndeavourOS, and more. When an anti-cheat vendor like Easy Anti-Cheat or BattlEye enables Proton support, they're not doing it as a favor to hobbyists. They're doing it because ignoring Linux now means ignoring a real, measurable chunk of their player base. And that's the point of no return. Linux gaming is no longer ignorable. Another reason this shift is permanent is Vulkan. Vulkan changed the rules completely. With DirectX 12 dominating Windows and Vulkan becoming the cross-platform alternative, Linux finally stopped being the odd one out. Games targeting Vulkan don't need translation layers in the same way. Performance becomes predictable. Driver behavior becomes more consistent. On AMD GPUs especially, Linux gaming performance on Vulkan titles can match or even beat Windows. That's not a hypothetical claim, that's something users on Fedora, Arch Linux, and OpenSUSE tumbleweeds see every day. Mesa keeps improving, RADV keeps getting faster, and the gap closes further with every release. Even NVIDIA, historically one of Linux gaming's biggest pain points, is shifting. The open-source NVIDIA kernel modules, while not perfect, signal a long-term commitment that simply didn't exist before. Distros like Ubuntu, Pop_OS, and Fedora make NVIDIA drivers easier to install and maintain than ever. Once that barrier falls, one of the last excuses against Linux gaming disappears with it. But the real point of no return isn't just technical. It's cultural. It's the fact that new Linux gamers no longer ask, "Can Linux run games?" They ask, "Which distro should I use for gaming?" That question alone marks a fundamental shift. The conversation is no longer about possibility, it's about preference. Arch Linux for maximum control and bleeding-edge drivers. Fedora for a balance of stability and freshness. Ubuntu for familiarity and massive community support. Linux Mint for ease of use and comfort, Pop_OS for NVIDIA users and clean gaming-focused workflows. Nobara Linux for pre-tuned gaming performance. These are not survival choices, these are optimization choices. And once users start choosing Linux distros based on gaming features instead of tolerating gaming on Linux, the ecosystem locks in. Tutorials appear. Content creators focus on Linux gaming benchmarks. Hardware reviews include Linux results by default. Game developers test Proton compatibility during development, not after launch. Anti-cheat support becomes expected, not optional. Each of these changes reinforces the others, creating momentum that can't realistically be reversed. There's also the Windows factor, and this is something a lot of people underestimate. Linux gaming didn't just get better in a vacuum. Windows gaming got worse in subtle but important ways. Increasing system requirements, intrusive DRM, aggressive background services, forced updates, telemetry, and a growing feeling that the operating system is no longer fully under the user's control. For a gamer who just wants their system to do one thing well, Linux starts to look less like an alternative and more like an escape. On Linux, you control updates. You control background services. You control what runs on your system. If you want Arch Linux with nothing but a window manager, Steam, and GPU drivers, you can have it. If you want Fedora with GNOME, Wayland, and Pipewire tuned for low-latency audio, you can have it. If you want Ubuntu LTS for a set-and-forget gaming rig, you can have it. That level of choice is intoxicating once you realize gaming no longer has to suffer because of it. The point of no return also shows up in benchmarks, and not just cherry-picked ones. Frame pacing on Linux has improved dramatically. Shader compilation stutter, once a nightmare on Proton, is now handled proactively through Steam's shader pre-catching system. CPU overhead has dropped. Input latency has improved. Even obscure controllers work out of the box thanks to Linux's robust input stack. These are the kinds of details that used to be deal breakers, and now they're either solved or actively being solved in public open development. Another thing that makes this irreversible is education. A whole generation of gamers is learning Linux through gaming. They buy a Steam Deck, discover desktop mode, realize it's Arch Linux, and suddenly Linux isn't scary anymore. They install Steam on their main PC, try Ubuntu or Fedora, and realize their library mostly works. From there, it's a short hop to exploring other distros, tweaking performance, and learning just enough Linux to be dangerous. Once people cross that mental barrier, they rarely go back. And importantly, developers are learning too. Game studios now have internal Proton testing. QA teams run games on Linux. Bug reports from Linux users are no longer dismissed outright. When a studio launches a game and it breaks on Proton, it's often fixed within days, sometimes hours. That feedback loop didn't exist before. Now it does, and it feeds directly into Valve's infrastructure, benefiting every Linux gamer regardless of distro. You can see this point of no return clearly in multiplayer gaming. For years, multiplayer was the final wall. Anti-cheat systems blocked Linux entirely. That wall is crumbling fast. While not every game works yet, the trend is unmistakable. When major multiplayer titles flip the switch for Proton support, it's rarely turned off again. Once enabled, it becomes part of the maintenance process. Rolling that back would mean actively choosing to lose players, and that's not a decision most studios are willing to make. Even modding, traditionally a Windows-centric activity, is becoming Linux-friendly. Tools like Proton Tricks, Lutris Heroic Games Launcher, and Bottles make managing prefixes, mods, and launchers far easier than it used to be. On Arch Linux, Fedora, Ubuntu, and Linux Mint, You can now run complex mod setups with less friction than on Windows in some cases, simply because the system stays out of your way. All of this adds up to something bigger than just Linux can game now. It means Linux gaming has momentum, institutional support, user demand, and technical foundations that don't depend on goodwill alone. Even if Valve vanished tomorrow, the improvements to Wine, Mesa, Vulkan, and the Linux kernel wouldn't disappear. Distros like Fedora and Arch Linux would keep shipping better drivers. Ubuntu and Linux Mint would keep focusing on usability. The ecosystem has become self-sustaining. That's what crossing a point of no return really means. It means Linux gaming no longer needs permission to exist. It no longer relies on a single company or a single project to survive. It has enough users, enough developers, and enough infrastructure that even setbacks wouldn't reverse the overall direction. The worst-case scenario now is stagnation, not collapse, and even that seems unlikely given how fast things are moving. So when people ask whether Linux gaming is ready, they're asking the wrong question. Linux gaming isn't waiting to be ready. It's already here, already viable, already competitive, and already shaping decisions in the wider gaming industry. Whether you're on Arch Linux chasing maximum FPS, Fedora enjoying a polished modern stack, Ubuntu sticking with familiarity, Linux Mint prioritizing comfort, or Pop_OS focusing on GPU workflows, the experience converges on the same reality. You can play your games, and you don't have to apologize for your OS choice anymore. Linux gaming didn't just improve. It crossed a line where going back doesn't make sense. And once that line is crossed, there's no turning around.